Valcha, welcome back. This is number 10, and I think this will be the last video on the dawn of everything. And let us just get right to work here, if I can untangle myself. So we have been talking about Cahokia, which was in relationship to this game Chunky, which was gambling. So Cahokia was about 1050 AD at its highest population, had about 40,000 people in the area with about 10,000 or more people in the town itself. It was about a 6-square mile, and it included 100 earthen mounds. The main city was built at one time. It was centered on something called Monk's Mound, which was an earth pyramid with a wood henge, like Stonehenge, only made of wood. And some pyramids were topped with palaces and temples. And they had resettled foreigners into new neighborhoods with an ethnic industries. So they'd have all of the Irish weavers living in one neighborhood. They had a ruling elite, and they were up high intentionally for the purposes of being surveilling everybody else. The rural population was scattered far in isolated homesteads. They had no self-government of communities outside the city. They had massive public executions and burials, and these were associated with the funerary rites of the nobles. There was a big opposition between the nobles and the commoners. Interestingly, this was a matrilineal society. The nobles could only marry commoners, and they were really heavily into preserving genealogy. They had a priesthood in their temples that were specifically to honor royal ancestors. They had a system of titles that were associated with, bestowed for heroism in war. Therefore, commoners could become nobles if they did something big. And each noble was symbolized with a birdman symbol as it became known. They had another symbol called the Corn Mother, who was sacred from 11th and 12th century sites, and it was linked to Cahokia from Virginia and all the way to Minnesota. So they had a widespread influence. They were aggressive in conflict. They were not an empire. They were more of a ritual alliance, but they backed it up with really high violent force. In AD 1150, Cahokia built a giant wall, and something happened, and their society devolved into war and destruction and depopulation, and the people fled the city, and then they fled the entire area. And by AD 1400, so in a couple of hundred years, they were erased from the oral traditions, and the area became the empty or vacant quarters with no people. We could say this was a second order regime. They had violent control and charismatic politics, and it came to an explosion. And it was very similar to the Mayan elite. They had warfare and competitive sports fused together, that game, Chunky. The administration grew around a ritual calendar to the royal aristocracy. They had very effective city planning and labor, but they also had extreme public surveillance. Descendants refer to any migration as a restructuring of an entire social order. You move away, you disappear, you build a new world, so you're moving on to a new country. That's how they talked about it. The Osage also talked about it like that. But it's easy to forget that these people had access to huge swaths of empty space. There was nobody living in large parts of North America. AD 1000 to 1200, while the Cahokia were emerging, Georgia and Tennessee area, ancestors of the Choctaw were emerging, and there was quite a bit of warfare involved in that process. They had a place in a valley called Etowah, and it was a combination in this valley of small towns with temple pyramids and plazas. Each had its own council house and a meeting place for all the adults. So they were, I couldn't think of a word for it, they were a network with no ranks. But by 1200 AD, it was abandoned. But in 1250, 50 years later, it was started up again, repopulated. They rebuilt this time with signs of nobles, with symbols from Cahokia, the birdmen. So here you had this egalitarian society with no stratification, no caste system, no ranks. All of a sudden it disappears and then infiltrates later with these noble classes. And they did have scattered homesteads in the rural area, but the Etowah area was some sort of a kingdom town. They just don't know much about it. It had a palisade with a ditch around it. And then again in 1375, so another 125 years later, it was sacked, desecrated, the area was abandoned, and priests were replaced by warrior rulers. But then again, it fell in 1500 to the Kusa, and it didn't really talk much about them. Okay, in 1540, a member of Hernando de Soto's expedition described Kusa and his core territory. Oh, it's a guy, Kusa. No, the Kusa is a place. The leader had a core territory, an area that was now known, oddly enough, as Little Egypt. The Cacique came out to welcome him in a carrying chair borne on the shoulders of his principal men, seated on a cushion and covered with a robe of marten skins of the form and size of a woman's shawl. He wore a crown of feathers on his head, and around him were many Indians playing and singing. The land was very populous and had many large towns and planted fields, which reached from one town to the other. It was a charming and fertile land with good cultivated fields stretching along the rivers. So they had little kingdoms like this. This is just the only description they have of this area, this one kind. But they were all over the place in the 16th and the 17th century, all over the Southwest. Outside the towns tended to be more egalitarian. Inside the towns, there was more contention, and as these towns disappeared, eventually the communities of a few hundred around emerged with egalitarian clan structures and communal council houses. The Southwest became a tribal republic, became mobile, and women were very influential. They still struggled with fading hereditary leadership, but as they died out, they managed to get rid of that. In the colonial area were the 5 civilized tribes, is what the white people called them. The Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminoles. And they were arranged like these other Southwest republics with communal councils. The stones of a hereditary caste of male priests who abused power, especially to women and people, massacred them. Oh, the stories of a hereditary caste of male priests. And these male priests abused their power, and they were especially abusive to women. And the people rose up and massacred them. So essentially, this is the story of their comeuppance. Each day, the adult men of a town would gather to spend much of the day arguing about politics in a spirit of rational debate. This is amongst the Creeks. In conversations punctuated by the smoking of tobacco and drinking of caffeinated beverages. Both tobacco and the black drink had originally been drugs ingested by shamans or other spiritual virtuosos in intense and highly concentrated doses so as to produce altered states of consciousness. Now instead, they were doled out in carefully measured portions to everyone assembled. When Jesuits reported in the Northeast, it seems to apply here too. They believe that there is nothing so suitable as tobacco to appease the passions. That is why they never attend a council without a pipe in their mouths. The smoke, they say, gives them intelligence and enables them to see clearly through the most intricate matters. Now, if all this sounds suspiciously reminiscent of an Enlightenment coffee house, it is not a total coincidence. Tobacco, for example, was adopted around this period by settlers, then taken back and popularized in Europe itself, and it was indeed promoted in Europe as a drug to be taken in small doses to focus the mind. Obviously, there is no direct cultural translation here. There never is. But as we have seen, indigenous North American ideas, from the advocacy of individual liberties to skepticism of revealed religion, certainly had an impact on the European Enlightenment, even though, like pipe smoking, such areas underwent many transformations in the process. Knowledge usually ended up in the evolution of an administration, a bureaucracy, some sort of format to control, and that's not unusual. That's exactly what goes on today. We recall even in much more recent times, qualifications to enter bureaucracies are typically based on some form of knowledge that has virtually nothing to do with the actual administration. It's only important because it's obscure. Hence, in 10th century China or 18th century Germany, aspiring civil servants had to pass exams on proficiency in literary classics written in archaic or even dead languages, just as today they will have had to pass exams on rational choice theory or the philosophy of Jacques Derrida. The arts of administration are really only learned later on and through more traditional means by practice, apprenticeship, or informal mentoring. Bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy, essentially. Knowledge of math, astronomy, etc. are often at the core of systems of domination. That's this arcane knowledge only for the limited few. And just as the Reformation was about retranslating sacred myth, the Bible, to more accessible forms, so too in North America, mathematical sacra of the complex geometric earthenworks and control of its shapes controlled the culture. Who could or could not partake in the sacred power became predominant. And then there's a link between incense used in church and tobacco smoke. Not that one came from the other. That's not what I mean. But that there was a similar use of that smoke to speak to the gods. So is this a transformation of a theocratic elite into an oligarchy? Did this sacred knowledge and possession of sacred objects, which made you special and gave you secret knowledge, eventually become an oligarchy? The Osage, originally from the Mississippi area, is that right, Mississippi? Yes. 1678 to 1803 were able to ally with the French in trading, and their ancient traditions were documented in the early 20th century by a Frenchman, Francis Laflèche, a native Omaha speaker. This gives us an idea. He was a native who was taken in by the French, and as a result, he spoke his native language, but he was French. So this gives us an idea of their thoughts. They moved in 3 seasons. They had permanent villages with multifamily lodges of 2,000 people. They moved to summer camps in the summer, and in midwinter, they had special camps for bison hunting. In the first, they had a circle that was divided in half. I mean, physically, the camp itself was divided in half. And what was considered the top half was considered the sky, and the bottom half was considered the earth, and it was apportioned between 24 clans. Each clan was represented, had representatives in each camp, and in any camp that they had to have a representative, at least one from each clan, and they had to be involved in every ritual. And this was about redistribution of power to everyone with an elaborate system of checks and balances. They saw their social structure as a series of legal and intellectual discoveries. They're very similar to Montesquieu in 1748, who wrote The Spirit of Laws. The government is a government of laws and not of man. And this is what these Osage tried to do. It's interesting that in 1725, a French explorer brought an Osage and a Missouri native delegation to Paris, and they met with numerous French intellectuals, and all of a sudden the French intellectuals broke out all over with ideas. Montesquieu was in Paris then and working on his ideas, and it's hard to imagine he would not have been invited to attend. And from North America, we see that an increase in control and violence was often overthrown for more egalitarian councils, that they would have this burgeoning domination and they would put a stop to it almost immediately. Still, the societies that European settlers encountered and the ideals expressed by thinkers like Candiaronk only really made sense as the product of a specific political history, a history in which questions of hereditary power, revealed religion, personal freedom, and the independence of women were still very much matters of self-conscious debate, and in which the overall direction for the last 3 centuries at least had been explicitly anti-authoritarian. The Wendat Confederation had been broken by war and famine and disease by 1648. And the individual members who survived were absorbed and scattered. Candiaronk spent most of his life trying to put a coalition together against the white invaders. And by the time his oral traditions of native politics were finally written down, most of the tribes were gone. They had been dispersed. They'd been killed off. One epic is left, the League of Five Nations, Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Mohawk. There was a breakdown of social relations, which led to chaos and revenge, and no social order. The powerful were cannibals. A hero comes and tries to create formal structure, and when peace is established, this peacemaker vanishes once again. This created a federal system of subordinate councils with male and female equality, with designated powers, but no compulsion and nothing to make it compulsory. And this still exists today, this form of government between these tribes. This story describes an all-powerful ruler who eventually was humanized and gave up power. The indigenous people of the East sidestepped agricultural traps and developed egalitarian societies with a strong sense of personal autonomy, and their ideas had profound effects on the Enlightenment. So now I'm going to move this so that you can see my candles. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. The last chapter, the conclusion, the dawn of everything. The book started with the question about the origins of inequality. So either we fall from grace and have a constant struggle for redemption, or humans are naturally thuggish and began miserably and violently and progress always in competition with each other. The more optimistic view, the progress of Western civilization makes everybody wealthier and happier and more secure. Okay, so the big question is, why hasn't it? Instead, for the past 500 years, European powers have been holding guns to people to force them to be Western. I guess it's not that appealing. Many European thinkers were racists who thought that most of the world was inferior and incapable of progress, and that the Enlightenment was just a naive movement. Modern social science is organized around 2 issues. What went wrong with the Enlightenment? The unity of scientific and moral progress and its schemes to improve society. And why do well-meaning attempts to fix society often end up making things worse? Why not just legislate a rational social order? How did a passion for liberty, equality, and fraternity produce the terror? The musings of philosophers like Rousseau have been less responsible for modern social theory than people like Bonald, who was a theocrat, de Maistre, who was a monarchist, and Burke, who was a Whig politician. These 19th century debates, all these questions, keep coming back up even today. Most would agree that the Enlightenment contributed to the American and French revolutions, that were self-conscious projects for reshaping society in accord with a rational ideal, and that revolutionary politics and earlier social movements were people who wanted to return to ancient ways or who acted on visions from some god or other. Pre-Enlightenment societies were believed to be traditional, slaves to custom, to gods, to cosmic forces, and that they didn't really think for themselves. They were in a mystical fog. Only post-Enlightenment people were able to think and change history. That's the prevailing belief. History rarely admits that earlier people had self-conscious social projects. They were too simple-minded, living in a mystical dream world for just getting by on a level of technology that was available to them and nothing more. 20th century sociologists look at the past societies as living in a modern context. We look at them through our lens of today, which is probably no more accurate than the Aztecs looking back at 1,000 years previously and trying to explain those ruins. But often societal change was stalled in a traditional mode by colonial authoritarianism, by not allowing it to change, so colonials could point out the eternal, never-changing lives of the subjects. They kept them down. Anthropologists focused on repeat behavioral cycles, seasonal cycles, rites of passage, dynasties, because they believed that their societies were trapped in a mythological universe where nothing changed, and so they were led by that assumption. Somebody called Mircea Eliade, a Romanian historian of religion, believed that traditional societies lived in a cyclical time innocent of history, that everything important had already happened and all great change and discovery had occurred at illo tempore, at that time, the dawn of everything, that all social change came from mythic and primordial pasts of gods and ancestors, and that any new change will be ascribed to a god or an ancestor in the mind of a traditional society. He also argued that the notion of linear time was an invention of Judaism, and it paved the way for the disaster of the Enlightenment. So, in other words, he was an anti-Semite, and Jews were to blame for all bad events in history, and people live in terror and anxiety about the future because Jews messed it all up. This guy, by the way, was a Romanian fascist. He belonged to the Iron Guard. So, huge block of salt there. So, a question is, why is it so hard to imagine early people making their own history from reasoned thought? Well, the mainstream answer is that social science dictates that people's actions and understandings are determined by forces outside of our control. We aren't free to think and affect our historical course. This is why history puts so much focus on things like technology, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the computer age. Or the prevailing belief of history is a sense of revolutionary breakthroughs like agricultural breakthrough, the urban breakthrough, the industrial revolution, and that these technologies shape us, that we don't shape them. And it's true, the technology helps to shape society. You can't argue that. But the authors believe that historians overstate the singular role of technology in social change. For example, Teotihuacan and Tlaxcalteca used stone, and Mohenjo-Daro and Knossos used metal, but their internal organization and size were not affected by those facts. Major revolutionary bursts don't necessarily change everything. For example, agriculture. It really wasn't a big revolution of agriculture that changed everything. That's not true at all. So there were no dramatic breaks with the past as Neolithic people moved forward with agriculture. They continued to do what they'd always done, or to improve, or to fall and start again, adopt agriculture, toss aside agriculture, come back and re-adopt it, stop doing large crops and start doing gardens, kitchen gardens. I mean, we've covered it all. Innovation depended on a collective body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, and usually by women, in slow increments of humble yet significant discoveries having to do with things like weaving cloth, making pottery, baking riced bread. Every day at breakfast, we benefit from dozens of prehistoric inventions. Yeast, that was women. Cereal, the growth of that, it all developed in a women's sphere with centuries of experimentation of accrued knowledge. The gardens of Adonis, ritual play farming, passed on the idea of planting and continuing planting and planting again the next year. In mining was first done to get pigments for women. Mesoamericans did not use the wheel themselves. They didn't have carts. They didn't use the wheel. But they built toys with wheels. They knew about them. They just didn't use them. Greeks invented the steam engine, and they used it. I did not know this. This is fascinating. Greeks had little steam engines, and they used them to open and close the doors of their temples magically as theater, religious theater. But they never built a vehicle that was moved by steam. They never used a steam engine to progress some sort of industrial thing. But they fully aware of how steam engines worked. The Chinese invented gunpowder to set off fireworks. Never occurred to them to make weapons. For most of history, ritual play was a laboratory and a repository of knowledge. So another question, is there positive correlations between gender equality, meaning women's freedom, and the degree of innovation in a society? Today we say the opposite, that technological discoveries make us prisoners of our creations. It makes us seem less thoughtful and less creative and less free. We don't describe history as a series of new ideas and innovations that communities collectively decide to apply to everyday life, but that's exactly what happened. It's also true of social creativity that authors found that ritual play was often the site of social experimentation. For example, A.M. Kohart, in the mid-20th century, an anthropologist, studied monarchies and institutions of government and said that they were derived from rituals that were designed to channel power from the cosmos to human society. So this one exalted person was supposed to be bringing power down from the gods, and they acted this out. But eventually the king started taking himself seriously, that the kings ruled from the dead, and hence elaborate royal death rituals were done, and that he was totally dismissed. Everybody thought he was crazy, but new archaeology suggests that that's exactly what happened in the Upper Paleolithic. We now know that private property came out of the context of sacred objects being the only things that were material value in a community, that they did not have property. They didn't consider property valuable unless they were sacred. Police power came from ritual gatherings. An interesting correlation between Native American, like Peruvian ball games that were fought to the death, medieval pageants, jousting, often reversed hierarchical roles, festivals around them. They would act out war. The heroes would have a chance to show off, and you could be the queen of the festival without being actually part of the noble family. We now know in Paleolithical times, many societies took on different social orders in different seasons. They moved regularly back and forth between economic and social orders. And did things start to go wrong when people lost the ability to imagine and enact other forms of social existence? Is it just that we've lost our ability to, we're so surrounded by everything familiar, we're all living in the same sort of state, and it's impossible for us to imagine a place where we could say, I don't want to obey you. The freedoms that seem to affect social order are the freedom to relocate, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands, or the freedom to shape new social realities, to move back and forth between different sorts of social orders. So the freedom to relocate and the freedom to disobey help to prop up the third, which is the freedom to move back and forth. And as long as the first two existed, the only kings were play kings, like in the Native American tribes, or play police seasonally, with members rotating and often recruited from troops of ritual clowns in Native American tribes. So how or why did we lose these freedoms? What happened? The prevailing modern belief is that there's no escape from institutional cages that we've made from ourselves. So how did it happen? There's very little evidence, but there's a lot of speculation. Division of societies into culture areas that define themselves against each other by exaggerating their differences and creating cultural identity caused what's known as schismogenesis. And this led to development of hierarchies with violence and warfare. Ritual games with fake violence often devolved. Once a player is dead, even if it's all a game, fun and games, the play king ceases to be a king. Ceases to be a play king when people start dying. Stuff gets real. War is a contest between two sides, and the scale changes. You know, the games were contests between two sides. All that changes is the scale. Major violence requires two teams, and all members are repaid for violence. They're equal targets. So how do I explain this? So you've got two armies or two teams, and they don't care who they hurt. Each member is an equal representation of the opposite. It's this called social substitutability. So think Hatfields and McCoys. Any old McCoy will do. Even large-scale warfare still requires a combination of ritual and drugs and psychological techniques. It's a well-known fact now that the German army was issued methamphetamines in their standard supplies that they carried with them into the battlefield. We all know about the drug usage during the Vietnam War. We all know that drugs were taken during the Middle Eastern, Iraqi debacle. Drugs were often necessary. Is it the Vikings? The Vikings would paint their body blue. They'd be naked, paint their bodies blue, and take psilocybin mushrooms before going into battle. Nobody wants to go get killed, and it's pretty hard to convince a healthy young kid, go lay your life on the line. But if they're brainwashed, that's the psychological manipulation, and you put a lot of ritual importance to it, symbology, insignia, uniforms, and then you feed them drugs, you're more likely to get somebody willing to go fight. There's little evidence of Paleolithic warfare. War was literally acted out in games. It's called Homeric War, where in the Iliad you see this, where two separate heroes would taunt each other, and everybody else just watched. There's evidence of periodic massacres with long periods of peace and no conflicts at all in the past. The link between external warfare and internal loss of freedoms is related to rank systems and domination. The modern state results from sovereignty, with its violence, bureaucracy with its knowledge, and competitive politics with its charisma, with the violence, knowledge, and charisma all magnified, these elementary types of domination are absolutely magnified. The ancient first order regimes magnified one of these forms of power. The Olmecs had heroic charisma. Second order regimes magnified two. The Egyptians had sovereignty and bureaucracy. Mesopotamians had charismatic competition and bureaucratic administration. The Mayans had sovereignty and dynastic politics. It all showed extreme violence. They all modeled central power on patriarchy. The same is true of most kingdoms and empires. There's a close connection between patriarchy, military violence. Why? It's hard to explain outside a language of terms taken from Roman law, because all the words we use came from that. So natural freedom is the power of the individual in Roman law. And the individual being the male head of the house. And to dispose, he has the right to dispose of his own property. That's his freedom. And, well, the word freedom comes from, relationship to slavery. Someone who owns something can do anything that he wants to do with it in Roman law. It's a simple power. And the only thing that mitigates that power is the law itself. So, no, I'm sorry, you can't destroy that statue that you own of the emperor, because no one's allowed to destroy the statue of the emperor. But you can kill your children. So freedom is seen as an exception to the legal order. And individual property owners owned freedom over their own property. These ideas go back to slave law. Property law came from the power of the master over the slave. And you see a nexus of violence and care. War prisoners were taken as slaves, and they forfeited all rights. They were considered things. They were taken into a household to provide care, but they could be disposed of as property. And in North America, the Wendat were very clear about slaves. Wendats were fighting with other natives in the Beaver Wars, and they fought war in general about mourning. So how they would fight battles were somehow somebody would get killed. So the relatives of that dead person would have to go and exact vengeance. And they'd form a military group, a war party, and they'd return with slaves. And the women and children were immediately adopted. And the men, it was entirely up to the mourners in the family of the dead person. So these male captives, the women mourners of the dead person family, could decide to do one of several things. They could give this captive male a name, the name of the dead person, the original victim. He would be trained for a few years to become a good member of the society, and then he would become a citizen. Or the women mourners could determine that that captive had to die, and if he was a male captive, a male warrior, he actually had to die. The death was by torture, and it was slow, public, theatrical, and violent. Everybody in the community was required to join in, women and children too, and it was situation was created, the person was kept alive for days, and it was a communal event. So this horrified the Jesuits, of course. But the Wendat didn't spank their children. They didn't punish thieves or murderers. They didn't use any kind of arbitrary, coercive authority within their own community. They solved every problem with calm, reasonable debate. And in these tribes, they had long periods of peace with no war and no violence. And the Wendat who went to France were appalled that the French punished their own people. They couldn't believe it when they saw people in stocks or public floggings. They were just absolutely appalled. So this Wendat is describing. Almost all punishment, including the death penalty, involved severe physical suffering, wearing an iron collar, being whipped, having a hand cut off, or being branded. It was a ritual that manifested power in a conspicuous way, thereby revealing the existence of an internal war. The sovereign incarnated a superior power that transcended his subjects, one that they were compelled to recognize. While Amerindian cannibal rituals showed the desire to take over the strength and courage of the alien so as to combat him better, the European ritual revealed the existence of a dissymmetry and irrevocable imbalance of power. So, let's see here, where am I? In France, the people were unified as potential victims of the king. The Wendats, the people unified in their violence. So the violence actually was a bonding thing and an emphasis on us against them. Wendat households were exact opposites of the Roman familia. The women decided everything. Slaves were killed or adopted, but no slave was kept and mistreated as property. That didn't happen. The French regime was like Imperial Rome. French society under the Ancien Regime represents a rather similar picture to Imperial Rome, at least when both are placed in the light of the Wendat example. In both cases, household and kingdom shared a common model of subordination. Each was made in the other's image, with the patriarchal family serving as a template for the absolute power of kings and vice versa. Children were to be submissive to their parents, wives to husbands, and subjects to rulers whose authority came from God. In each case, the superior party was expected to inflict stern chastisement when he considered it appropriate, that is, to exercise violence with impunity. All this, moreover, was assumed to be bound up with feelings of love and affection. Ultimately, the house of the Bourbon monarchs, like the palace of an Egyptian pharaoh, Roman emperor, Aztec, Tlatoani, or Sapa Inca, was not merely a structure of domination, but also one of care, where a small army of courtiers labored night and day to attend to the king's every physical need and prevent him, as much as was humanly possible, from ever feeling anything but divine. In all these cases, the bonds of violence and care extended downwards as well as upwards. We can do no better than to put into words made famous by King James I of England in the True Law of Free Monarchies from 1598. He said, as the father of his fatherly duty is to care for the nourishing education and virtuous government of his children, even so is the king bound to care for all his subjects. As the father's wrath and correction on any of his children that offendeth ought to be a fatherly chastisement, seasoned with pity so long as there is any hope of amendment in them, so ought the king towards any of his liege that offend in that measure. As the father's chief joy ought to be in procuring his children's welfare, rejoicing in their weal, sorrowing and pitying at their evil, to hazard for their safety, so ought a good prince to think of his people. The French public torture, the message was that the system let the husband brutalize the wife and parents beat their children, but that this equaled love and violence equaled care. The Wendat torture, they had no form of physical pain inflicted in their community at other times, and they were emphasizing that violence and care were opposites and separate. Understanding violence and care in a community helps to explain the loss of freedom. The biggest misconception is scale. The received wisdom of today is that domination of systems is the result of population growth, and that there's a relationship between social and spatial hierarchies, that as populations grow, the size of towns grow, hierarchy grows. The assumption is that the larger the population, tensions grow and the more complexity becomes necessary. Complexity equals hierarchy, equals chains of command, equals a state. Therefore, as soon as there's an increase in the number of population living together, they must abandon freedom to refuse to obey and replace it with a way to punish and jail people. History does not bear this out. Carol Crumley is an anthropologist who's an expert on the Iron Age Europe. And the complex systems don't have to be top down. There's archaeological evidence to disagree that many ancient cities began as experiments without administrators, without active hierarchies or authoritarian rule. We call them egalitarian, for lack of a better word, but the term is really not accurate. They might have had an urban parliament. They may have had citizen assemblies. Principles are the same. Mesoamerica had the urban parliaments. The Black Sea had the citizen assemblies. In Uruk, in Mesopotamia, they had a principle of conformity and uniformity and sameness to make everybody equal. But remember that these cities emerged from wide connected networks of many diverse communities, small groups in loose coalitions that were different from each other. This is called amphicyteny, which is a formal organization that's put in charge of the care of sacred places, like the natives in the mound building societies who moved from place to place. They were joined together by the care of these sacred places. The mere existence of human settlements did not make monarchies, a warrior aristocracy, or stratification inevitable. The heroic societies of Anatolia had hereditary aristocracies in small groups. In Teotihuacan, they had some urban populations that were headed towards a monarchy and then suddenly retreated and began a program of social housing and equality for everybody. In some cities, they started as assemblies and became warlike dynasties. And the Sumerian monarchs insinuated themselves into the temple areas of the gods, where social care was attempted. The temples were originally providing care and refuge for women and children, and they developed workshops as a way for them to help support themselves. They were the first factories, and women were honored. Women's arts were honored. But eventually, as warlike attitudes increased, these people included war captives and slaves and were looked down upon, and it led to a decrease in status for women in general. And gradually, care became violence. The question is, how did we get stuck in a social reality that normalized relations based on violence and domination? Franz Steiner, an anthropologist and poet who died in 1952, he was Jewish from Bohemia. He lived with Arabs in Jerusalem, where he was expelled by the British. He did field work in Carpathia, where he was chased out twice by the Nazis. And ironically, he ended up in southern England. His entire family was killed in Birkenau. He had 800 pages. This is one of the most disturbing things I have ever read in my life. He had over 800 pages of a doctoral dissertation on comparative slavery, societies of slavery. And it was in a suitcase on a trip he was taking, and it was stolen out of a train. It contained copies and drafts and explanations, and his entire dissertation gone. He was the boyfriend of Iris Murdoch, the novelist. 2 days after they got engaged, he dropped dead at the age of 43 from a heart attack. Ugh. He did publish a shorter doctoral work on pre-servile institutions, which discuss people who are unmoored. Interestingly, this man who was battled about from place to place wrote about people who were expelled, people who were criminals, runaways, refugees. And he said that originally in history, most refugees were welcomed as sacred. And you still see this in some societies where guests are welcomed. I know in Ireland, if you're a guest, I mean, you're brought food, you're brought drink, you're given full attention. It's a big deal. It doesn't matter who you are, how unexpected you were, and how long you stay. Guests are honored. That's true in many cultures. And it comes way back. Refugees were honored. They were considered sacred. And gradually, this sense of degradation and exploitation, like the Sumerian captives and the women in the temple, basically shows how a loss of freedom to relocate leads to a loss of freedom to disobey, his dissertation. And he asked, what happens when norms that make relocation possible, things like hospitality and asylum and civility and shelter, erode? So often this is a catalyst for people to exert arbitrary power. And it's not in the book, but I cannot help but draw parallels between the children in the cages, the hatred towards refugees, the negative reaction of certain places, I believe Idaho, about Afghani refugees. You lose that care for other people. You're giving up your freedom yourself. He asked, if societies organize themselves so the chiefs have no top-down power, how did those coercive forms eventually come into being? Steiner suggested that it's about charity. Chiefs took in the needy monarchs as chiefs took in the needy. Monarchs were protectors of widows and orphans, and courts were often made up of people that were helped. Ice Age burials of anomalous individuals were the forms of much care for the vulnerable. Feminist researchers have argued the connection between external male violence and internal loss of status and care for women and other vulnerable members of society. They started a book to look at least 30 or so years of, they started this book to look at 30 or so more years of recent research, and they discovered huge gaps. They say it's because there just isn't even terminology for a lot of what they found, and it's hard to study and generalize when they just don't even have words for it. So how to describe egalitarian cities that weren't necessarily 100% egalitarian, but they were. It's like comparing a hippie commune to a biker gang. There's some similarities there, but that's not really. But there are, but not really. And there just aren't sufficient pieces of evidence to draw a lot of conclusions in some of these cases. The authors realized that they had to approach the gaps and conventional conclusions by approaching everything from a completely opposite point of view. They had to get rid of terminology like equality, unless absolute evidence for it existed. They had to look at gaps in the research and assume that that gap in time was significant and that stuff happened, and it wasn't a period of stasis leading up to a pre-dynastic thing, that there were people thinking and doing and creating. 5,000 years of serial domestication did not lead to armies and aristocracies and debt peonage. And yet, this serial domestication happened and was set aside. Happened again and was set aside for other choices. They discovered new facts, that slavery was abolished multiple times in history in multiple places. And war also was rejected for long periods in which free or relatively free societies existed, and these periods represent the vast majority of human social experience. Whether they're acknowledged or not, they existed. And social theorists act like history can be predicted. Well, today is the inevitable outcome of the last 10,000 years, and we cannot say what 2075 is going to look like. So it's not fair to put that on the past. We can't say this is inevitable. This book says to look at aspects of the past not as anomalies, but as roads not taken. That community scale and bureaucracy, that cities governed by neighborhood councils, that women being in charge, land management based on caretaking of the environment. Places like Minoan Crete and Hopewell look at the pyramids and the monuments as historical curiosities because they are the curiosities, they're the exceptions that prove the rules. And history puts these things on the margins, these cooperative cultures, they're put on the margins. And part of it is an unwillingness to acknowledge because their existence doesn't support popular patriarchal beliefs. This book reminds us that people lived these different ways, often for millennia. In some ways, such a perspective might even seem more tragic than our standard narrative of civilization. As the inevitable fall from grace, it means we could have been living under radically different conceptions of what human society is actually about. It means that mass enslavement, genocide, prison camps, patriarchy, or regimes of wage labor never had to happen. But on the other hand, it suggests that even now, the possibility for human intervention are far greater than we're inclined to think. We are moving towards a time of Kairos, and it was just easier to read this to you. We began this book with a quote which refers to the Greek notion of Kairos as one of those occasional moments in society's history when its frame of reference undergoes a shift, a metamorphosis of the fundamental principles and symbols, when the lines between myth and history, science and magic become blurred, and therefore real change is possible. Philosophers sometimes like to speak of the event, a political revolution, a scientific discovery, an artistic masterpiece, that is, a breakthrough, which reveals aspects of reality that had previously been unimaginable, but once seen can never be unseen. If so, Kairos is the kind of time in which events are prone to happen. Scientists around the world appear to be cascading towards such a point. This is particularly true of those which, since the First World War, have been in the habit of calling themselves Western. This book proposes a purpose for new knowledge, to rediscover freedom, to create new and different forms of social reality. History and myth are impossible to reconcile with the new evidence that we have. There just is a lot of new evidence. Max Planck once remarked that new scientific truths don't replace old ones by convincing established scientists that they are wrong. They do so because proponents of the old theory eventually die, and generations that follow find the new truths and theories to be familiar, obvious even. We, the authors, are optimists. We like to think it will not take that long. In fact, we have already taken a first step. We can see more clearly now what is going on when, for example, a study that is rigorous in every other respect begins from the unexamined assumption that there was some original form of human society, that its nature was fundamentally good or evil, that a time before inequality and political awareness existed, that something happened to change all this, that civilization and complexity always came at the price of human freedoms, that participatory democracy is natural in small groups but cannot possibly scale up to anything like a city or a nation state. We now know that we are in the presence of myths. The end. I loved this book, and I just am astounded. From a casual conversation on a walk with a neighborhood dog walker, we are presented with a book that fits beautifully within the context of the numerous political books that we've been looking at recently. Books about totalitarianism, books about insurrection and the attempt to overthrow governments, and books about, just the enormous variety of things that we've been reading. So I'm going to do a bit of a conclusion tomorrow, and we'll read cards. So I beg of you, if you have questions for the cards, put them at the beginning of your comment in big letters so that my eye catches them. Because frequently when I do these book readings, I get a lot of comments, and that's wonderful. But it takes ages to go through them, and I miss questions because I eventually poop out, do my video with the questions, go back to look at the comments, and suddenly discover there were comments I missed that had great questions. So if possible, put them at the forefront, and I will do my best not to miss any. And tomorrow we'll go over them. And then big news, this is your reward for sticking with this to the bitter end. On Monday, I am doing another video with Maya. We're going to do another crime solvers. We're going to try to look at some more unsolved crimes or disappearances and throw the cards on them. And I'll give you one hint. There's one big one, and I am so excited to do this. That's all I'll say. My lips are sealed. That will be Monday afternoon. So in the meantime, I'll be back tomorrow to read the cards on, world history and Slongafoil and Slancha.